Warm welcome to everyone. So this session we're going to focus on the future of FAIR for this NA session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Emerson, the Research Data Manager at Newcastle University. And along with Nick in the NH, Rose at Sheffield and Danielle and Claire at Manchester, this is the third RDM focused event we put together. And hopefully you've attended the previous ones, and if so, it's great to have you back. And if it's your first event, we hope you find it useful, and the talks from the previous events are available online as a growing resource we're building up, and I'm sure we'll share those within the chat and future newsletters. But as this is our third event, and the third one virtually, we thought we'd adopt a slightly different approach this time and actually run a networking event so attendees can meet each other, which is so difficult to do with the online meetings. It's a lot of presentations and then a little bit of time for questions, and that's all we get time for. So as we were pulling this event together, we thought the question is then, what do we get you all to talk about in the networking event to focus the time we have together over the next 2 hours? So for this, we thought of no better person than our speaker today, Sarah, who very kindly joined us to talk about the FAIR principles as they are, and also to consider the future. So a little bit of Mystic Meg, think about where we're trying to move to in the future. And Sarah's been working in this field very successfully over 10 years, and many of you know her through her work in the DCC. So the plan is for Sarah to provide us with a view on the future as FAIR as she sees it, and then we'll take time for questions, and then I'll let you know how we're going to run the second half of the workshop or the session of how we're going to run a networking event to talk about the topics raised and also our own institutional perspectives. That's enough from me, and I kindly welcome Sarah to kind of take the reins from here on her view of FAIR.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. But I will let you know a bit about what FAIR is, what activities have been going on or are planned, and a little bit about, where I think things should go in terms of institutional support. Now, I know some of you in the audience probably know lots about FAIR, so apologies if this is a little bit like teaching Granny to suck eggs, but I've included a bit of just what the FAIR principles are, just in case anyone isn't familiar with them. So you probably know what FAIR stands for. It's a set of principles that ensure that data are shared in a way that enables and enhances reuse. And I think one of the things that's kind of fundamental to FAIR is that it's not just reuse by humans, it's reuse by machines as well. So we need to make sure things are not just documented, but documented in a machine readable, machine actionable way, so that we're able to combine and process data effectively. So inherent in that, you'll find that standards are kind of at the core of a lot of the FAIR principles. So these are the 15 principles that kind of came together, and they're grouped under these 4 aspects of FAIR: the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And as I mentioned before, you'll see that they focus on kind of adopting standards and kind of key things like persistent identifiers, because that enables us to make sure the data sets are well described and can be understood by both humans and machines. And if you want to kind of dig into FAIR, when you read the principles at a high level like this, there's often quite a lot of scope for interpretation. What does that exactly mean? How should this be implemented? And one resource that I've found very useful is this kind of the FAIR principles explained from the Dutch Tech Centre for Life Sciences. So what they do, they take all of the different principles and they give you explanations about what that means and further context and links. And this might be a little bit hard to read on screen, so I've just picked out one example. So one of the principles is that metadata and data, so we kind of apply this principle to both of those concepts, are richly described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. So here, it's explaining that we need lots of labels on our data so that we can find and reuse it, and that it's not just about discovery. It's one thing to find the data, but if you want to actually reuse the data, you need to understand the provenance, you need to understand how that data set was created, for what purpose. So this is why you need this kind of rich documentation. And the plurality, they explain that this indicates that it should be as generous as possible. We want to ensure things are really well described, very rich documentation, even to the point that you might think something's irrelevant, because it's very hard to predict the future reuse or what somebody else might need to know about your data. Now, one thing I would flag about FAIR is that it's not really anything new. So if some of you come from kind of library communities or research communities, you've probably been doing a lot of the things that are inherent in the FAIR principles already. So lots of research communities have been sharing their data in a fair way. And this is one of the things I'll mention later about the FAIR Data Expert Group and the report that came out of that. We had some case studies in there from astronomy and from linguistics and other disciplines that showed that they'd already been kind of adopting this, but FAIR's a fairly new term. It came out, I think probably like 5 years ago. There was a workshop in Leiden. And I think what's really good about FAIR is that it's kind of a meaningful and memorable articulation of the concepts. The acronym is good. People want to be fair, like when we think about the way research is, we want to be ethical and open, and fair sounds like a good thing. So I think it's actually a good way to engage research communities because it's a concept that they like, and that, is something that you naturally want to follow. And similarly, we've seen that FAIR's had a lot of traction with research funders and internationally with lots of different communities. The other thing I want to flag, and this kind of came out of work we did with the European Commission, because FAIR is something that's in the EC's policy as well as open data, a lot of people often conflate these terms of fair and open, and the two are not synonymous. You can have a data set that's fair, but is actually, sensitive data, or it's restricted access, or for some reason it can't be shared openly with others. And you can also have open data, so some content that's available to anyone under an open license, but it may not be fair. It might be data that's really poorly described and not very reusable. So these two concepts kind of overlap, and data can be, both fair and open, or it could just be one, or actually it could be neither of them. And both of these concepts really apply on a scale. So you can have degrees of fairness. You saw before there's like 15 principles. A data set could be fair if it's following some of the principles, not all. So there's always ways to increase the fairness. And similarly with open data, you can make something more open and more useful. If you've seen the kind of 5 stars of open data from Berners-Lee, that's kind of pushing at that point that really it's not just a case that something's got an open license and is available to all. We want to make sure it's also reusable and well described and kind of linked data. So I think we want to kind of push for the highest degrees of fairness and openness, and ideally both when that's feasible for the particular data set. And I did some work with Rosie and Daniel Bangert, thinking about how open and fair and RDM intersect. And when I was first kind of mapping out some of this, I was looking at it as a kind of pyramid, but it suggests that you progress from one stage to the next, which is not the best. But for me, kind of underlying everything is having data managed, because the management is kind of the primary concern. And I think it's the kind of self-interest concern of researchers. They need to manage their data to be able to do their work, to process it, to know what's the correct version, and to be able to go back to that data, in subsequent years if they're building on it in future research. Whereas both open and fair data are really implying, something's been made available to others. So it's more of an external community benefit. And I think this is important to distinguish, because the kind of case, the arguments you would make to research communities about being open and fair are maybe slightly different, because, it's not, they benefit maybe through higher citations and through getting more research collaborations, but I think the management of data has, it's maybe an easier argument to make because it's a self-interest. And if you're interested in that work that I did with Rosie and Daniel, we did a paper that was published in the Insights Journal where we tried to map out these different kind of axes and how they intersect, and looked at, how, you can propose open and fair as a good way to engage with researchers and help them to manage their data. So that's a kind of bit of context on what FAIR is and how it kind of overlaps with other kind of concepts that you might be working with. The next thing I wanted to reflect on is the kind of increasing uptake, because I think most of you have probably heard the term FAIR we're seeing it more and more, particularly with research funders. I mentioned before about the European Commission and its policy, which kind of drives open data and FAIR. But many other funders internationally have picked up on FAIR as well. So ZonMV, which is a health funder in the Netherlands, the Swiss National Science Foundation, HRB, Science Europe also have guidelines, and they're a kind of overarching body for all research funders in Europe. So increasingly, we're seeing FAIR becoming part of the kind of policies that are driving not just funders, but then also institutions. So I think it's being picked up more and more. And within EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, FAIR is quite a key concept. It's something that the Commission's kind of written into all of its work. And then when they've had working groups, this diagram actually came out of the FAIR working group. And we've kind of proposed FAIR as the glue that enables us to federate data and services, which is the kind of key aim within EOSC. So the FAIR principles have been used as the basis to develop the EOSC interoperability framework to make sure we're addressing, both the technical and the semantic interoperability, and making sure that we will be able to combine data sets and services. Now, in terms of how FAIR's been addressed within the European Commission specifically, there have been a number of groups that have looked at what's needed to turn FAIR into reality. The first group was an expert group that ran from 2016 to 2018, and it produced this report, which you can get on the Commission's portal. And this really took quite a holistic view about what's needed to actually implement these principles. And I've kind of noted the key chapters of the report here. So we looked at the basic concepts of FAIR. But the main thing we tried to address are two sides: the culture, so kind of what's happening within research communities, and then also the technical ecosystem that's needed. And I think those two kind of sides of that coin are really important, because it's not just the technology. Obviously, we need services to assign PIDs and make sure that data can be discovered, but we also have to make sure that following the FAIR practice fits into researchers' workflows and culture. And then we looked at aspects such as the skills that are needed, making sure there are data stewards to support research communities, looking at like the incentives and also the investment and sustainability of services, because FAIR data should also be persistent. It's not something that we want to find we can't actually resolve that DOI a few years down the line. And then following on from that group, there was an executive board that was set up, and that board had a number of working groups, and FAIR was one of the working groups. And there were a number of reports and recommendations that came out of that FAIR working group, which I've listed on the right. One that I think is of particular interest if at your university or within your group you're looking at practice across different research disciplines is the first one. And this was a set of recommendations for implementing FAIR practice, and it looked at different research community practices, looked at which communities had good solutions in place, what could be learned from those communities, which communities needed more support or more infrastructure in place to enable them to be FAIR. We also developed the EOSC Interoperability Framework, which is now being continued through one of the funded projects, the EOSC Future Project. We developed a persistent identifier policy for EOSC, which again is now being implemented through the projects. And we also looked at FAIR metrics and certification of services, and made recommendations on both of those, which are then becoming part of the way that we have requirements on those that are providing data or offering services through EOSC. And the next kind of phase of this work, an EOSC association was set up, which is a legal entity to try and help govern and steer the EOSC initiative. And that has a series of task forces which are in the process of being set up now. And some of these address FAIR specifically. The FAIR metrics and the semantic interoperability ones, I think, are really critical for implementing FAIR. But I've noted some of the other task forces as well, the interoperability of data and services, but also some like the research careers and recognition credit or data stewardship curricula, I think could be of interest to this community specifically. The important thing to mention about these task forces is that there's an open call for members at the moment, and that closes at the end of July. So if you're interested in being involved in these groups, do apply before that deadline. Some of the groups have open membership. So the AAI task force, for example, other ones have recommended a kind of limited number of like 25, 30 people. So there will be some kind of selection if we get more applications. But something that came out of the EOS symposium recently was a call that we have as open and inclusive as approach as possible. So I think even if people aren't full members of those groups, we'll maybe have some kind of like observer role or some way that the community can be consulted at large. So if you're working on FAIR or any of these kind of topic areas and are interested in getting involved, I'd encourage you to apply. And then the other thing that has largely come out of the European Commission, there's been lots of funded projects. Now, this isn't comprehensive because there are many more projects than this, but lots of the projects have focused on FAIR specifically. So FAIR's FAIR was about implementing FAIR. We've had FAIR in the health domain. There are other projects like Freya, which deal with persistent identifiers, which is a key part of the FAIR principles. And then within the cluster projects, which are kind of research community focused, or within like national initiatives, there's often a work package or tasks related to FAIR specifically. And I've put EOSC Future on here as a logo. This is the new kind of major investment the Commission's made in implementing EOSC. And this will also be addressing FAIR in a number of ways. So developing the interoperability framework further, making sure that we have all the relevant kind of guidelines in place to enable people to share FAIR data. So there's been lots of investment and lots of work that's gone on around how to implement FAIR. So you would think everything is going very swimmingly, and I think to a large extent it is, but there are still challenges. And I wanted to kind of reflect on those before making kind of recommendations for universities specifically. So a lot of data isn't actually well managed, let alone open or FAIR. So if you think about my pyramid before where I said kind of managing data is the first step, you still find many instances of where data stored on a hard drive, or it's not documented at all, and then you have major issues that people can't even get their own data back. So I think it's often quite a big hurdle for researchers to think about being open and FAIR because things are not set up in the way that's needed to make that trivial, and it's also that they don't always have the support they need in place. So why is that the case? I've kind of half answered that question already, but I think one of the challenges is that actually being open and FAIR takes a lot of time and effort. This is a fairly old blog post now, but this guy had talked about how much effort it took him to kind of share all the data and code associated with his research paper. And he's kind of broke it down to, the time to double check things, reformat the data set, prepare the files, share them in a repository, making sure his code was cleaned up. And it's a significant amount of time and also some financial costs to, submit to certain repositories. So I think it's not always easy for researchers to follow these principles. And I think one of the barriers as well is that the recognition and rewards aren't always there yet. People aren't always credited for making their data fair or open. And I think we do need to build some of those incentives into either career progression structures or, things you're having to put on your grant applications to show that you're following the policies of the funder that you're applying to. And the other thing that came out of various reports, but one from the FAIR working group and from other sources, like this one from the Dutch use cases, is that different research communities are at very different stages in terms of the implementation of FAIR. So some are very well organized, they've had their standards in place for years, they've got a lot of protocols of how the community works internationally and when it's expected that you share your data and under what license. Others are still in the very early stages of developing those standards. And I think we also can see a bit of tension between, domain approaches, because we do need to have research communities develop their own approach, and also then how we bring those together, because initiatives like EOSC are, intended to promote cross-disciplinary research. So we're trying to do things that map across all of these community standards, and that can be a challenge. So to bring this to a close, I wanted to think a little bit about how we implement FAIR and maybe some of the roles for institutions. This is a very basic checklist that came out of one of the European Commission funded projects. But if you're in a position where you're doing training with researchers or trying to introduce a concept of FAIR, this one pager can actually be quite helpful because it's phrased in a way where it's going through the principles, but just wording them as like a checkbox saying, you know, is there a persistent identifier assigned to your data? Are the metadata online in a searchable catalog? So researchers can quickly kind of see, am I meeting these criteria? And that can be one way that is helpful to try and implement and help people understand what the principles mean. I think in a broader sense, what we need to do is kind of adopt a model for FAIR digital objects. And I'm going to give you essentially some of the key concepts that came out of the FAIR Data Expert Group report here. So when we were looking at, you know, the concepts within FAIR, we developed this model where we said, you know, digital objects, it's like a package, really. So you have the data, the digital object itself, but that needs to be identified. It needs a persistent identifier. It needs to be structured in a way that it's understandable to others. So we need to be following the relevant standards for that research community or for whatever field that data set comes from. It needs to have the relevant code to allow you to process that data, and it needs all of this kind of rich metadata. So we developed this kind of object model to say it's not just the data, it's this package of content that makes it FAIR. And obviously it needs, you know, the licensing, so we know how that data can be reused as well. And as I mentioned before, there's kind of the two sides of the coin. We need to address the cultural aspects as well as the technology. So we developed this kind of very basic diagram about the kind of the infrastructure that needs to be in place. We need infrastructure for persistent identifiers. We need to support communities to develop standards if they haven't got them already and have registries of standards. We need the repositories to actually store the data in. And then kind of overarching this, we've got the kind of policies and the DMPs, because ideally those would be things that were machine readable as well, and also in registry, so we can actually have this kind of network that we can easily search across. And then looking at the more kind of cultural aspects, obviously you need the relevant skills in place, both within the research community, but also within the support community, so that researchers have people to help them document and share their data. So data steward kind of roles. We need metrics to be able to monitor the implementation of FAIR, and then we need to build those incentives and make sure that all of this is sustainable, so we have appropriate investment in the system. And then I think the other thing that's key, I mean, FAIR is all about standards and interoperability. And as I mentioned before, communities are at different stages. So we really need to support research communities to develop their standards if they're not already in place, but also to maintain those standards. It's not just a case of saying, here, I've defined DDI or whatever other standard, job done. These things naturally evolve. So you need a kind of effort and a governance framework to allow you to evolve those standards over time. And that kind of work needs to be recognized as well. Ideally, that would also happen in international fora. You can see examples of certain research communities where that already happens, like the IVO in astronomy. And really, those communities that are more advanced ideally would be sharing good practice and helping others to kind of, you know, learn from their lessons to develop their own kind of interoperability frameworks. And then the kind of final thing I wanted to say is that FAIR is really a joint responsibility. So what I've done here is taken the 15 principles and mapped out, you know, what is the researcher's role in each of these principles and what is the service role? Now that service might be an institutional service, or it could be something that comes from a disciplinary community or some other kind of infrastructure, like a research infrastructure. But if we think about, you know, something like rich metadata, or looking at one of these, the licensing, for example. The researcher needs to choose an appropriate license, but also the repository needs to support that license. They either need to require the license as a field in the submission template, or they need to give support around what is an appropriate license for the data. So there's kind of a dual responsibility here. And mapping through it, I kind of feel like there's more responsibility on data services than researchers, because it's very difficult for researchers to be fair if they don't have those support services in place. So what I've done is tried to map out the key things for researchers to do and the key things for institutions to do. So for researchers, it's adopting the relevant standards, and within many research communities, there is a standard, for describing the data, or different kind of ontologies and taxonomies that are used to, describe the actual content itself, and making sure that they create rich metadata and documentation. So I mentioned earlier, FAIR's about making sure things are reusable, and you want this plurality of relevant attributes. So following standards, explaining the provenance of the data, making sure you've got the usage license, and all of that kind of content that goes together. So the associated code or details about the workflow that's being used. And then the other thing that I think is key for researchers is using appropriate data services. So using repositories that will assign a persistent identifier, make sure the data's indexed and discoverable, and that the services they choose, enable access. They use authenticated access if it's needed, or it might be entirely open. And I think researchers also have a role in developing and advocating for or contributing to the community standards. I think it's the research community at large, like the different fields or disciplines, that really need to be developing those standards. And then from an institutional perspective, obviously raising awareness of standards. Many librarians have said, researchers aren't always aware of the standards in their field. That's one of the things that often comes up on data management plans. So helping to make people aware of good practice, helping researchers select appropriate data services. And now that might be your own institutional provision, or it might be community services that you direct people to. And if you're running a repository, I think it's worth trying to make sure your repository supports FAIR. So make sure it assigns persistent identifiers, that the metadata in your repository specifies the PID, that you're exposing the metadata so that it's harvestable by, kind of wider search engines, using the standard protocols for access, cross-referencing all the different data resources, and making the metadata accessible even if the data aren't. So if the data's for whatever reason removed, still having like a tombstone record about that data. And the other thing for institutions is just trying to set those requirements. So having your own institutional data policies and advocating for good practice, so that FAIR is something that's not just in the policy, but is something that can be followed because you have all the services and support in place. And that, for me, is kind of the inherent link in implementing FAIR, that if, in order to be fair, you need the services that enable that. So I think there's a real kind of role for researchers, but it's very difficult for them to follow FAIR if they don't have all of that support in place. So I think it's important for institutions to engage in the FAIR agenda as well. And my final slide, which is a kind of wider point, much bigger than individual research communities or institutions, is that I think there's a much bigger community responsibility as well, because the FAIR principles, as I mentioned before, have been picked up very widely by many funders internationally, by many research communities. And I think there's also an issue around the governance of the principles themselves, because as we as a global community of open science or RDM people adopt and become more dependent on these principles, we need to also ensure that they're community owned and governed. And we asked this question at the EOSC symposium last year in Budapest, and most people felt that some governance is needed and that should take place in an international fora. And I think that's really important, because FAIR is not something that's just, from one domain. It's not something that's just about EOSC. It's something that's really been adopted globally. So I think we need to bring together the different research communities and stakeholders so that we can, if needed, iterate on the principles in future. They seem very robust and they seem to be working well, but there's already been differences in interpretation. So I think we need to think about the kind of governance of the principles themselves too. And that is my last slide. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was brilliant, and covered a lot of the plotted history and a lot of the challenges we face now, and also very much looking to the future, which is exactly what we're looking to have a discussion now. So really open the floor up for questions. We have a hand up already.
Not to be too critical of the EC. I think the problem is that a lot of these things are written into remits. So for the FAIR Working Group, for example, it was in our remit that we addressed certification of FAIR. And I think probably for FAIR's FAIR as well, I mean, that's responding to a call, and I don't remember the call exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had certification in there as a specific task. So I think sometimes there's like an external driver like that affects things. The way we tried to handle it in the FAIR expert group was that we'll address certification, but we will say we are not ready for this. Like the community at large is not ready for this. Very few repositories are certified, and there's no way you can say that only certified repositories are acceptable, because if the EC ever took a line like, or any funder took a line like that, then the community, can't deposit in the well-respected and, very well-functioning domain repositories, or even a lot of institutional repositories aren't certified. So you have to be pragmatic about how you roll these things out. I must admit, like in the EOSC agenda now, like what's coming through the exec board, I'm not seeing the same push on certification. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it raises its head again, but I mean, it was definitely very clearly there in the roadmap for EOSC. No, so there are community standards for this. So there's, from what I remember, there's 3 main standards. There's an ISO, an ISO standard, which is a very heavyweight standard for certifying repositories. There's something that was developed by Nestor and Dini in Germany, which is, I can't remember what that one's called, but again, that's quite a heavyweight standard. And then there's QuadraSeal, which is a merger of 2 standards, one coming from the World Data Service and one coming from DANS, the Data Seal of Approval. And that's kind of the most lightweight repository certification. It's a self-assessment, but still, even as a self-assessment, I think it takes repositories, I don't know, probably like a couple of weeks of work, because you have to pull together all your policies, show how you're meeting all the different criteria. So it's something that you get a certification that works well, is valid for a couple of years, as far as I recall. It's a more general thing. So okay. QuadraSeal is really about the viability of the repository. Do they have appropriate policies in place? Do they have they considered, longevity plans? So if the repository funding's pulled, is there a plan to migrate the data elsewhere? The work on QuadraSeal, they've been doing a mapping to the FAIR principles and adjusting some of their criteria so that they can, also address FAIR aspects, because a lot of things that were covered in QuadraSeal are also relevant in FAIR. So it already covered a lot on documentation and identification and all those aspects. So I think that work is with their board at the moment. So probably within the next year or so, you could say that this is a FAIR certification of repositories as well. But it very much predates, I think, QuadraSeal's been around for a few years, but the legacy things that came from have been around even longer, probably like the last decade or so. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And again, like when we were doing the FAIR report, we said, the very basics of FAIR is to make sure that, your data has an identifier, it has some at least basic discovery metadata, which should be quite simple. So like your repository submission form, and it is licensed. So at least you know what the content is, who can use it, you can identify it. And you're right, that step about, following DDI or whatever other community standard is, a bigger hurdle. I think the way to hopefully get people there is to make sure that they are aware of those disciplinary standards, but also have support from the outset of the project. Because if it's built into the data capture process that this metadata is being captured, or if there's a data steward that's familiar with the standard and can help people make sure things are documented and conforming to the community standards, then it's a lot easier. So I think I don't know, it's a lot about that project planning stage for me, I think, and trying to slowly build these things into the regular practice of a particular research group or lab, and yeah, making it something that is just part of the regular practice. But that, again, it's an evolution. Like anything new that we learn, whether it's making ourselves jog every so often and start to get fit or anything, it's a slow kind of burn. It doesn't happen overnight. So I think trying to just kind of slowly encourage more fair practice, bit by bit. So it's not an incentive, my answer. But so my background is in archives. So, a lot of what I would do is throw things out, because actually you have to select. Not everything has long-term value and should be kept. And I also believe not everything has, research value and has to be fair. And because fair is a lot of work, to make sure things, and for any, whether it's fair or open, if we're documenting all the data richly and making it all perfect and machine readable, it's a lot of effort. And I think it's hard to engage people in that discussion about what you actually should be bothering making that much effort for. So there is a section in our Turning Fair into Reality report about selection, but I think it's kind of, most people have just skimmed over it and not really noticed it. But I actually think that selection's a really important part of the discussion, and one that maybe researchers don't always engage with, because all the data seems valuable. But I think you've got to be pragmatic. You can't make everything open and fair. You've got to actually think about where are you best to invest that time, and focus on that content. Yeah, so the work we did, there'd been a lot of work that had been done within the RDA, the Research Data Alliance, looking at the FAIR principles and developing a set of metrics so that you could, check the maturity and see, how fair different objects were. And what we did is we took that work, because it had been done in an international forum, so something that had already got community consensus, and we essentially applied that to EOSC, and we made a recommendation on, these are the metrics that we think are appropriate to apply to EOSC like now. And these are, the metrics that we think you could apply in 3 years and 5 years time. Because as we were mentioning before, it's not, FAIR doesn't come for free, it's not easy. And we don't want to be saying, all of these metrics apply, you need to meet all of this, because you're going to alienate and lose half of the research communities, because it's not feasible for them to meet it. So we took like a small, low-hanging fruit level that we thought was realistic to implement at the start, and then slowly progress that up to try and help people up that kind of ramp that we have as our analogy. But I think, metrics, they can be divisive, because people then, game the system so that, their stuff looks fair or whatever. But I think if we can get beyond that kind of compliance level and actually use it as a more of a positive thing, that people, see the benefit of being fair, that their data is more recognized, more reused. Because if you think about things like, I know the H index is also, a bit controversial, but researchers like to see themselves ranked and rated highly. We all do. We all like to see, oh yeah, look, I'm super duper on top of this leaderboard. We had a Pac-Man game at a conference last week, actually. Everyone wants to be on the top 20 leaderboard of Pac-Man. So if we can find a way that, people are like, yeah, I've got really good quality fair data, and they see a benefit from that and credit and use the metrics in a positive way, hopefully that's something that can be an incentive too. Yeah. Well, I think it's a kind of two-way thing. It's people having the faith that, yes, I should return data to the ref, but I think they don't, because, it's the unknown, and you want the best 4-star publications because that's what everyone's been putting in, and you don't want to, look less than your peers. But funny enough, I was having a discussion with my boss the other day about, gender and diversity, and that sometimes you actually have to say, look, you have to put a man and a woman forward as your nomination, because then you actually get some balance. And I think maybe, the ref committees, panels have to say, yeah, out of your 5 papers or your 5 objects that you're putting in, you have to have one data set, because otherwise you won't get that one. I think sometimes you actually have to force and drive things to get that cultural change, because people are quite worried about adverse consequences, like metrics being used to fire people and whatever. So yeah, I think it's a policy push as well as trying to encourage people to take the leap of faith.